So my name's Gary Sanders. I'm an operations manager in Devon County Council, responsible for organisational safeguarding, which is where we've kind of looked at our contextual response. But I just wanted to kind of guide you that I'm speaking today on behalf of Devon Children and Families Partnership, because what I'm going to share with you in terms of the framework is not a social care initiative, it's actually a Children and Families Partnership initiative that we've looked at using across all agencies to include our police, kind of social care and wider safety partnerships to look at exploitation. I'm also conscious that I'm going to be presenting for about kind of 10 to 15 minutes, and so I'm not going to be able to probably answer questions as I'm delivering, but what I've just put in the chat is a link to the framework's website where all of our information is kind of housed, but also at the bottom of that page we have a frequently asked questions page that kind of indicate that may answer some of your questions. So I would kind of direct you to there if you've got any kind of further questions or kind of queries. So I'm just going to put the slides up and hopefully you can see them. So in terms of this kind of short presentation, what we're wanting to share with you really is Devon's response to exploitation and the needs of its kind of adolescent population. And what we've looked at doing is using the work of the Contextual Safeguarding Network and the work of Bedfordshire University to look at how contextual responses to child welfare can be utilised as a way of targeting both improved welfare responses for young people, but also contributing to wider community safety for the broader population. So what we kind of recognised is that as a children's partnership, we were able to recognise that exploitation and extrafamilial harm is abuse, but that our system was not equipped to respond to that challenge. So our existing child welfare and child protection system for all of us is designed to protect children primarily from harm within their families. And our responses when we were thinking around exploitation and extrafamilial risk were often blaming or critical, with the emphasis on kind of individual pathology of a young person, or blaming adult parents and carers about their capacity to control or provide suitable care to their kind of young person. And that our system was really from a deficit model of seeing the issue of exploitation as a problem with parenting or with the individual child. But I guess for all of us here, we recognise that for teens and adolescents, peer relationships and influences beyond the family have a wider impact during that stage of development, and that our responses really needed to promote it kind of improved collective community responsibility and approaches to improving kind of both protection and the rights of our teenage population by really contributing to safer contexts and environments in which they're kind of operating. And that we needed a system that was able to respond to the context at the same time that create harm for young people, whether these be their peer relationships, whether those be the places and spaces in which they kind of operated. So within Devon, we recognised that we needed a framework or a systems approach that increased safety and that improved coordination between kind of partners concerned with child welfare, but to broaden that welfare partnership to go beyond both the conventional partners of police, health or education, but to include our community safety partnerships, our local councils, housing providers, parks and recreation and local businesses to contribute to that sense of improved safety. And that when we were looking at the framework, we had to look kind of wider than looking at just individual impact for an individual child, but looking at wider collective impact for creating safer places and spaces for the wider youth population. And I guess the best way, if anybody's familiar with this CD cover, it probably kind of reveals my age, but when we look at this CD cover, this is our conventional child welfare system, that we focus on the risks inherent within that individual young person, and whether there is appropriate kind of care or response to create that safety. But I guess I use this image because this is the easiest way for me in explaining very quickly what we mean by contextual safeguarding. And that's about widening our lens, essentially. A contextual lens, when we're looking at this image, says, what are the risk features that we could be targeting within the environment? So here, that being the shark. How do we disrupt the shark and the risk that that shark may play? So within an exploitation narrative, that may be county lines, drug users, kind of perpetrators of sexual harm. Similarly, how do we utilize positive social support? So in this analogy that I'm showing with you, the dolphin might be assertive outreach. It might be kind of educators, local youth groups. How are we utilizing their input to create safety for that young person? And then if we look at the seabed here, that you can see that the seabed in itself is harmful, how are we creating environments that are safer? How are we looking at our parks and recreation around lighting, around management of vegetation to deter kind of spaces and locations that might create risk for young people? So this just image helps me remember that a contextual response is looking wider than the family and thinking about how we utilize those location spaces and people in those areas to create improved safety. So the kind of broad principles of the framework that we've adopted is that it's kind of rooted in recognizing the value of adolescent development and the recognition of the impact of trauma on young people. So when I kind of speak about that, it's recognizing around kind of normative risk taking, but also thinking around how adolescents, if we think about neurological kind of science, about how do we engage young people during this period of maturation, and that rather than problematizing adolescence, that we should see it as an opportunity for engagement, creativity, and co-creation with young people. And that kind of leads on to the concept of seeing young people as assets and resources, that we need to look beyond risk. So when we were thinking around exploitation, clearly that often comes from a deficit mechanism, but we also need to think about that young people are needing to kind of explore their communities, develop relationships beyond their families. But how do we do that in a way that kind of meets those needs, but is done in a way that is collaborative and safe? That we need to think about the principle of relationship-based social work. And I know across your program this week, you've been looking at those kind of features, but thinking about how collaborative, trusted relationships enable kind of restorative ways of responding to risk and harm. That we also needed to think about a welfare system that was more integrated. So this framework goes across not just social care, but our early help offer, all the way up when we're thinking about our care leaver population into transitional safeguarding into adults, so that we're kind of reflecting all of the aspects of a young person's kind of life. But also thinking that we need to adopt contextual approaches, as we've kind of indicated, that we need to think about the places, spaces, and locations that people operate in, and how we make those safer. And the framework itself is not, and this is one of the challenges of the framework, it's not creating a new intervention service. It's utilising the existing services that we had within our locality, but making sure that they were better organised, better, more accessible, and that partners knew how to utilise aspects of the framework more effectively. Again, in this kind of short presentation, I can't go into the complete detail of the framework, but we call this the bullseye, which kind of essentially looks at how the framework operates. Again, the child is at the very centre of a response, but that we utilise the existing frameworks of kind of early help, child in need, child protection provision, to look at individual pathways to support a young person who may be at risk of extra familial harm through exploitation. But beyond that, we also use a number of context-based interventions in order to create safety, which I'll elaborate on in a moment. And then that sits within our wider kind of MACE panels that have a more strategic overview. And then what we've indicated beyond that is we've tried to use both wider initiatives in terms of community safety partnerships, and the role of that in terms of wider neighbourhood safety for the wider population within a contextual framework as those that have been identified by Bedfordshire University. So if I kind of just explain what we mean by the different pathways. So within Devon, we've created what we call the Safe for Me assessment, which is similar to a single assessment that some of you may be familiar with, but that Safe for Me assessment is solely focused on issues of exploitation or extrafamilial harm. And that assessment tool is used throughout the partnership. So that tool is not just a social care tool. Police colleagues may use that tool. Education may use that tool. You may have community safety partnerships completing that tool. And the Safe for Me assessment is broken up into multiple components. So there is an individual where you might do an individual assessment around a young person. And then the second part of that is a contextual assessment. So assessments that may include the neighbourhood, the school, or the peer network, the social network of a young person. The model, as I've kind of indicated, uses two different pathways, and those pathways can be used simultaneously. So there may be an individual pathway, which we refer to as either the Safe for Me pathway, which utilises the conventional TAF or child in need process, or a Safe for Me Plus mechanism, which is our child protection mechanism. So in Devon, we at the moment have special dispensation from the Department of Education to use a fifth category to child protection registration, where we look at children where extrafamilial harm has been identified, so we would note harm outside of the home. And we've changed our language to be much more collaborative with young people and parents to move away from that pathologizing of it being a parental deficit or a young person deficit, but recognizing that exploitation still should be seen within that significant harm threshold. The second pathway is the contextual pathway. So we use both assessment, intervention plans, and meetings to focus on peer group interventions, neighbourhood interventions, and school interventions. And then we use our MACE to give consideration to how we target adults of concern around disruption activity. Colleagues in the call here will be familiar with how MASH kind of systems operate within children's services, but we now have an exploitation hub, and within that hub, that becomes the mechanism in order to coordinate the framework and encourages professionals to use a contextual lens. And what I mean by that is that individuals are able to refer a context into social care rather than necessarily a young person. A young person may not need a social care response, but actually because of their association with a group, that particular context or peer network can be referred into MASH for a social care response. And what we've tried to incorporate within Devon is the golden thread of seeing exploitation as a whole system approach, rather than it being a specialism held within a team, that exploitation is considered at every element of a young person's journey through a child welfare response. And that's kind of reflected in all of our kind of paperwork, our kind of literature around single assessments, our kind of wider planning, and it extends interestingly to our care leaver population, which is a slight challenge given that when we're thinking around the areas of exploitation, that transitional safeguarding remains a challenge between the age of 18 and 25. So in order to kind of make this feel a bit more real to you, I just wanted to kind of use the last couple of minutes just to give a case example. So when we're thinking about an individual, which I'm going to refer to as Billy, we identified some commonalities between his individual assessment of need and that of his wider peer group. And as I've identified here, I've just kind of summarized some of those common themes that kind of sat across both his individual need and the group's need. We noted that criminal exploitation was a feature, that across the peer group there was increased missing episodes for all of those young people, that for many of those young people within that group they were excluded from education or further training opportunities, that peer-on-peer violence was a feature, and that poor mental health and self-esteem were an issue for a number of those young people. And so through a partnership approach, when responding to extrafamilial harm, we were recognising through those assessments and intervention that it wasn't a deficit of parenting that was causing that, but some of those external kind of influences. So with kind of co-creation and collaboration with both Billy, we were able to do an individual plan that looked at his own social, emotional, and educational needs, and that was supported through a Safer Me Child in Need plan. But at the same time as his individual plan, there was also three separate contextual plans that sat alongside his individual plan. So there was a peer group plan that kind of focused around intervening with his social network, and that came in the form of developing a parent carer support group. So a number of the parents connected to those young people were brought together to try and make their parenting feel more resilient, and helping them with kind of coping strategies. That we focused on assertive outreach and community outreach to that group in the places and spaces they were operating, recognizing that they were less likely at that time to engage by turning up to a youth centre, and that we looked at disruption activity of certain individuals within the group. So we used some civil and criminal tools in order to look at dispersing those that were particularly critical or harmful within that network. Within Billy's school, we had a school response in terms of looking at how we were influencing school culture and PHC programs around criminal exploitation. And so looking at the wider peer network through educative means and bystander influence by developing the knowledge and skills of not just the cohort, but the staffing team and educators around them. And then finally, we had a neighbourhood plan around the particular places and spaces that Billy and his associates were going to. So, for example, we targeted a particular park that they were operating in terms of improving lighting, making free Wi-Fi available at a local bandstand so that the young people would congregate in one place that was more visible. That during the kind of even though COVID was occurring, we used the park to encourage adult groups to attend there, like drama groups. So there was bystander impact to improve safety and visibility for that young people. So I hope you can see what the framework tries to do is there may be an individual response, but actually we needed to respond at multiple kind of levels. And kind of my final slide is just to think about some of the challenges of implementing a framework. So what I'd encourage people to think about is that if you were looking at this kind of framework, is that you need to identify broader stakeholders beyond those conventional child welfare partners, to include business, to include kind of community safety partners. That there is always a challenge of using a framework as opposed to an intervention model. So the challenge for all of us as partners is clearly in pressured times, we want more resources in order to support young people. But I think in Devon, we were aware of some of the resource limitations. So it was about using the framework to target what we already had available to us. And as I've kind of mentioned very briefly, the challenge of adolescence. So we know from neuroscience that adolescence extends beyond those statutory parameters that are set within kind of local childcare services. So we've had to do a lot of work with, for example, with probation, with adult services, managing that transitional gap that can pose a risk to young people. And I guess, conscious of time, but thinking that this kind of approach to safeguarding takes significant cultural change for not just within social care, but in terms of those partners that are part of the delivery of improving safety for young people. And then just to guide you in terms of some resources that you might find helpful, as I said in the link, I've already put the link to Devon's Adolescent Safety Framework, and all of those resources are open to anyone to have a look at in terms of guidance around how to convene a peer group assessment, how to conduct a peer group meeting, to how to hold school interventions around exploitation. But also I would just signpost you to the National Working Group on Exploitation. There's lots of resources that can be utilised both at a strategic and at a practice level around exploitation. The work of Bedfordshire University at the Contextual Safeguarding Network, which kind of identifies a number of tools that can be used to operationalise a contextual response, And then toolkits that when people are saying, how do we use civil and criminal tools within the legislation to look at exploitation and disruption, I've just put 2 links in there, which kind of given it some practical guidance around navigating some of the legislation when relating to exploitation. But so kind of that's the end of my bit of the presentation. I know that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but as I said, I would guide you to our website if you've got any kind of further questions.
Thanks, Gary. Really appreciate that. Jenny, are you okay to come straight in?
Yeah, I am.
Thank you.
Hi there. So my name's Jenny Simpson. I am a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University. And so what I'm going to do in the time that I've got available to me is I'm going to share with you details with regards to my research that I am undertaking at the moment called Me and My Mobile. So what I'm wanting to do in the first instance really is just to give a little bit of a framework in terms of what this presentation will cover. So it's the background to the project, Me and My Mobile, the actual project itself, where we're up to, and also the practice implications. So let's go to the background. So the background in terms of the project really stemmed from some work that I had undertaken with regards to my PhD. And my PhD looked at children in care and their use of mobile devices for contact. And I just asked this very basic question, which was, are children making use of mobile phones for contact? And coming out of that came a whole range of responses. But in many ways, let's begin with the challenges. And the challenges, certainly when I was looking at the literature, was around this notion of unsupervised contact. In particular, primarily because children and young people in care had really taken on board the mobile phone and were using it and embracing it as part of their normal lives. But also the reaction to that by social workers and foster carers was such that there were concerns not only about contact, but there were concerns about cyberbullying, access to inappropriate websites, commercial exploitation, and also the sharing of personal details with people that were not known to them. And so what this meant was there were very real concerns that I think every parent has in terms of their child and their access to the internet. But also what I found was a number of surveys had been undertaken, and one of them was a foster carer survey in 2017, and another one was undertaken by the Children's Commissioner at around the same time. And what was found was that foster carers were finding it really difficult to manage the mobile phones and to apply controls to these devices in the same ways that they could do for computers and Wi-Fi. And also what foster carers spoke about was this limited amount of support that they were receiving from their supervising social worker. And so it seemed as if there was a real challenge right across the fostering sector. So certainly, as you can see there, what we're talking about is this incredibly new phenomenon. And yet, even as a phenomenon, there was a lot of comment by social work practitioners, by foster carers, but very little research to help us understand exactly what was happening. So on the back of that, I actually undertook my research, and there are a number of findings that came forward, and the title of my PhD was 21st Century Contact. And what I found was that for many young people, they didn't think of the use of their mobile phones to stay in touch with different members of their family as contact. They simply saw it as staying in touch in the same way that you and I have done throughout the whole of the pandemic, that, you know, to send a text, to send a picture, it was simply a way of staying in touch. What I also found was that young people had what's called a multimodal approach. So they were using a number of different platforms, WhatsApp, Facebook, video calling apps. And also what I found was that it allowed them not just to stay in touch with immediate members of their family, but also the wider network in terms of family members. So when this is compared to contact itself, particularly that which is supervised, what I saw was that staying in touch via mobile phones was found to be dynamic. It wasn't time controlled, it wasn't organized by adults, it wasn't supervised, and it wasn't monitored. And with that came a great deal of liberation and freedom. And also what it did was it followed the pattern of normal living, which when you think about contact, that's not something that readily happens. In terms of the reaction of foster carers, what was found was they often associated the use of mobile devices with risk. And this was particularly around the familial network. And they were really concerned about they were concerned about young people getting in touch with members of their family, and it wasn't supervised in any way. And both parents and family members were seen as quite harmful. Although in terms of my study, that wasn't the case. I appreciate that. My study was a small study, and I suspect that there are a number of practitioners who are listening in at the moment who can tell me a number of circumstances that they've had where contact with family members has been harmful. So I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that within my study, that's what I found. What I also found was that there was little acceptance of the type of communication. And I think what foster carers were doing was they were thinking that actually face-to-face contact was a much better form of communication for the young people. I think now that we've had the pandemic and we're slowly coming out of it, I think what we can see is that there's not that natural divide anymore, that actually FaceTime is just as good as potentially being in a room with someone. What I also found was that in terms of foster carers monitoring what was happening, there was this notion of surveillance and monitoring. And this came in three forms. So in terms of physical tasks, using computer software, and monitoring through other agencies. So asking other agencies to monitor what was happening and how that device was being used. What I particularly found was the physical tasks and activities tended to be carried out by foster carers who were not so confident with the use of mobile devices and technology. And in actual fact, the reverse was true for foster carers who were very confident. They would make use of computer software to monitor what that young person was doing. There was also day-to-day management in terms of how the Wi-Fi was made available to young people, and it was almost used as a tool to manage behavior, is what I found at times. So it was turned off and on at will by foster carers, dependent upon the circumstances at the time and whether or not that young person was behaving appropriately. What I particularly found was that in terms of how the mobile device was used, how Wi-Fi was made available. In particular, there was a lack of negotiation between the foster carer and the young person in care. And in many ways, there was no dialogue. And where there was a lack of dialogue, there was tension. And so coming from these findings, I started to think about, is there a tool or is there a mechanism to create a dialogue between the foster carer, the carer, and the young person in care, and also to support placements. So what I came up with was this idea of me and my mobile. So let me first of all just say thanks to the local authority that is helping me to actually undertake this research. I'm hugely grateful, given the fact that there are huge challenges with regards to the pandemic and the call upon services. So I'm really, really grateful for that. So in terms of the project itself, it aims to design and pilot and evaluate a toolkit in order to support supervising social workers, as you can see there, and also foster carers, and to explore mobile phone and internet use by children and young people in care. And it's important that I say that with this project, it actually moves away from the issue of contact just to look at generally how mobile phones are used. It's also about enabling communication in a way with young people that is both effective and knowledgeable around the use of the platforms that they use when they're communicating with others. I think a really important thing is about exploring how children and young people actually keep themselves safe whilst online. And I think it's really important that we remember that they get an inordinate amount of input from their schools. And it's about how do we build on that and how do we use that? And they learn from each other as well. And then the final aspect is really about how to negotiate the use of mobile devices so that actually there is a bridge of understanding. Because certainly what I found in terms of my research project, my original PhD, was that in actual fact, the experiences of young people, particularly if they move from one placement to the next, they experience different rules and different regulations within that new foster setting. And so what happened was, again, there would be tension. So let's just move on to the 3 phases of the research project. So we've got phase 1, and what we're doing at the moment is we have a series of online art workshops, one for young people in care, another for foster carers. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk to them, and we are talking to them about their experiences. And building from that, we will create a series of scenarios. From that, those scenarios will be turned into a toolkit. So at the moment, what we're thinking about, or what I'm thinking about, is a kind of graphic novel. And that graphic novel will set out a series of scenarios, and it will be the prompt to have those conversations when there are any tensions, or when a young person comes into a new foster care setting, or even when they're leaving a foster care setting. And I think, it has its place in terms of placement agreement, when a child, when a young person first goes into a placement. And so through that tool, there will be this dialogue and a wider understanding about the importance of the mobile phone for that young person, who they're contacting, who they're not contacting. And also it provides an opportunity for the foster carer to share what, how it works within their home and what they normally do. And then we will go into phase 2, and we're hoping to do that in April. And this is a training workshop for foster carers and supervising social workers in terms of how to make use of the tool. And then we go into the final phase, which is about the evaluation of the tool itself, how it has worked. Has it made any difference at all? So that's what we're going to do. In terms of where we are up to now, we had our first workshop, the first online workshop yesterday with young people. And what you can see is some of the comments made by the young people in care. And I have to say, because of my PhD, I really wasn't surprised by many things that were said. And just to kind of sum them up, really, what the young people were saying was that their phone is absolutely essential for everything. And that's become even more important because of the pandemic and lockdown. And so without a shadow of a doubt, I don't think we're going backwards in terms of how young people within care make use of their mobile phones. This is now here to stay. We were also hearing about young people who were in fostering households with more than one young person in care. And that in and of itself can pose incredible challenges, particularly for foster carers. If you've got one young person who is really not managing the use of their mobile phone very well, and there are others that are. And the young people were talking about almost feeling penalized because once the Wi-Fi got turned off for one, it got turned off for all. And so that was a really interesting aspect that I had never thought about. What we also heard was, particularly for those young people who are older, that there was a greater level of confidence in terms of their maturity as to how they make use of their mobile phone. And that there's a real difference in terms of maturity, and for those that are older, they have much more freedom, and for young people who are in maybe between 12 and 15, there's less freedom. So it's things like they're having to bring the mobile phone down at night. And one young person gave the example of there's another two young people in her fostering household. One is age 15 and he takes his mobile phone down at 10 o'clock at night, and one that's 14 and she has to take her mobile phone down at 9:30. And it was like half an hour. You know, how does that work? What's the rationale that sits behind that? So there's some really interesting things that come up, but also young people were talking about the fact that they too become annoyed by other young people in their household, i.e. the young person who stays up till 2 o'clock in the morning talking to her friends. So, you know, there's a real understanding by young people about mobile phone use. But obviously there's much more work to be done, and we've only really just started on the journey in terms of understanding mobile phone use within the fostering setting. So let me move on then to the practice implications. What has happened, there has been a review by Neil, Cropton and Sorensen last year, and what they did was they looked at how contact was being managed with regards to children in care, and they looked at an entire age group right across the piece, from, you know, a baby through to 15-year-olds. And I think one of the things that was really heartening about what they discovered was that practitioners rose to the challenge, absolutely rose to the challenge in terms of making use of WhatsApp, FaceTime, Zoom, and Microsoft Teams. And a great deal of imagination was used. So an example of that is a parent purchasing a coloring book for herself and her child, and then simultaneously undertaking the activity and sharing progress with one another. And so for some people, it worked incredibly well. But what was also apparent was that, you know, it didn't work so well for when you're dealing with very young children who couldn't kind of sit in front of that camera for very long periods of time. And again, foster carers were really imaginative in terms of how they managed that process. So they took a video film and then made it available. But what was also apparent was that there is still formal and informal dynamics at play. And I think what we can see there in this quote kind of reflects that there is still this level of control that happens, particularly when we're talking about younger children. And here, the example I think was for quite a young child. But what do we do when we're talking about pre-teens and teenagers? And I think I would say, without a shadow of a doubt, there is a need to expand our thinking in terms of going beyond contact. And what that does is take me to my final slide. So we need to think beyond contact, and we need to think about use in general. We need to balance both risk and opportunity as far as young people are concerned. We need to help them recognize effectively how to use that. And we can do that by working alongside them. There's also a need, certainly from the research that I've undertaken and much of what I've read, for clear guidance for both practitioners and also for foster carers. There's a need to develop a range of tools that help support the negotiation of mobile phone use, not just a series of resources that are about staying safe. And there's lots of resources out there, things like Think You Know and CEOP, which are very much focused on protect, protect, protect. But in actual fact, we also need to talk about negotiation, negotiation, and negotiation. There's also a need to appreciate privacy as a part of a young person growing up and as they mature. Because, and I say that out of the fact that in terms of my research, what I saw and heard was foster carers and social work practitioners expecting to know everything that was going on with that young person in terms of their mobile phone, even to see the messages that were being sent to them. We also need to think widely and imaginatively about strategies that promote safe use of mobile phones. And the same is true for strategies for the poor use of mobile phones as well. That's it from me. My final slide just really covers some papers and some research that I've been doing for a number of years now, I realise, with regards to this area of practice. I suppose that I would finish simply by saying that this is an entirely new area of practice and that we are all learning. And I hope to continue learning as we go along. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jenny. That was incredibly interesting. I'm conscious that we've only in theory got 11 minutes left, but the next presentation will take longer than 11 minutes. So just to make people aware that the session might overrun, completely appreciate if people can't stay, but would also really like if people could stay to the end. So just to make people aware, Debbie and Tom are up next, and yeah, just to make people aware that the session may overrun. So Tom, do you want to come in and just do your introduction, and I'll just load the video up as you're speaking, Tom.
Great, yes. So I'm Tom Stibbs. I'm the Principal Social Worker for Children and Families in Brighton and Hove. I'm going to keep my introduction very quickly because the film is obviously almost 15 minutes long, which is the time we were given for our slot. The film that we're going to show you focuses on our Young Ambassador project, and this trains and supports young people with care experience to be involved in the social workers and managers at all levels. The film highlights the impact this has for the young people, for social workers, and for the organisation. So over to the young people now, but please do take down our email addresses at the end for me and Debbie, so you can contact us if you've got any queries. I joked I was going to say this, so I will take the opportunity to say it. Roll VT.
Okay, so hi, I'm Holly. I'm a young ambassador for the youth participation team. And a young ambassador is a care leaver that has been given the opportunity to take part in interviewing social workers. And to do that, we've taken part in a two-part training session, which is partly theoretical and partly practical, and the theory part is learning about aspects of recruitment, and the practical part is mostly role play. And by achieving this, we get the opportunity to sit on the interview panel with the adult professionals and basically give our opinion and our voice on what we think of the social workers that are interviewing for the job. And
okay, why do you think it's important to involve young people who've had experience of the care system when we're interviewing for social workers who are going to work with them?
I think it's important to give the young person freedom and a bit of just experience and opportunity. So yeah, I don't.
Okay. Chanel?
For me, as a young person, as a service user, it's really important to get our views across, and it's all good being interviewed by professionals that are obviously going to be your colleagues or your bosses, but you don't often get that opportunity to be interviewed by the young people and service users that are going to be your caseload, and I guess it really puts those opinions into perspective for the professionals as well, to see what we're looking for in comparison to what they're looking for.
We'll be judging them from a different perspective. So we're not going to be judging them on, you know, their professional abilities. We're going to be looking at them from more of like a service user viewpoint. Like, are they approachable? I don't know, do they seem like warm and friendly? So I guess we just have a different perspective to bring to the table, and I think that's really important when it comes to forming consensus and hiring these people.
Right. What do you think you've got from it? What, you know, has it helped with improving any skills, confidence, raised aspirations?
I definitely feel like being on the interview panel is let me gain communication skills, because I always struggled a lot with communication between adults and authority. It's really interesting for me because I've been able to interview a lot of different people, not just social workers. I've seen different aspects of the council roles and what it takes to be there, and the personal experiences that people have had. And it just gives young people a chance to be heard when it comes to the interviewing process, because it's
yeah, no, I remember when I left the building back in 2016-17, and I just felt so filled with confidence, like I'd gained this new experience and I'd had the opportunity to sit in that professional like setting, which I hadn't had the opportunity much to do before, because, you know, I was a care leaver. I'd come from a bit of a wobbly background, and I hadn't always had professional opportunities or taken them when they were given to me. So it was just really nice to have the opportunity to develop that skill and be in that professional setting, and I took a lot from that.
Yeah, hi, so I'm Vinny. I'm 26. I'm a care leaver. I was involved with the process of interviewing social workers and directors for the in the top end jobs for the social services department back about 7 years ago.
Hi, my name is Fatima, or Fatimata. I was involved in the Young Ambassadors project, which was getting us involved in recruiting social workers. I was involved in 2014, 2015.
I think it gives the right centre-person approach that children's services, social services and social workers should all be about, really. It's the services for the young people to support and benefit their lives. So having them interview and having an impact on who are the process and a voice of who gets the jobs is, I believe, such an important and correct route to have, and it's really good to know. So a lot of young people don't feel like, how's that social worker got the job, when actually they're involved in who actually got the job.
Yeah,
I believe I was 18 when it happened, so I was feeling a bit lost with myself, what I should be doing going forward for job wise and stuff like that. So when I had a chance to be when I had a chance to be part of an important board asking questions to these professionals, it gave me a sense of belonging, it gave me a sense of meaning, and it also gave me a clear understanding of how I could mirror what they were doing in the interview. So for example, the candidate going for the interview, I kind of understood what questions they'd be being asked, how they would present themselves, in the manner they would ask it, and I also felt, being a child in care and at times feeling a bit lost and not having an identity, it kind of gave me a purpose, and a big meaningful purpose by having that role on the board and be involved in it. And yeah, that was something I was grateful for.
I was just saying, prior to joining the Young Ambassadors, I didn't have much of an experience, like a work experience. So joining that team actually helped me gain that experience that I needed. And also the fact that I just came into the country. I didn't have a lot of friends and family, but being part of that team actually helped me boost my with a way of thinking that I can actually work in this country. I can actually confidently gain employment. So being part of that team was really, really helpful for me. Yeah. Sorry, there are a lot of skills that I gained from that. For example, like being able to sit down in a meeting, in a group and chatting, you know, that I got that only because I was involved earlier on in that group in the young ambassadors, because we met different people. We were able to present to different people. I met important people within the council. So I think being involved in that particular project helped me actually, because when I was sat in my own interview for work, I was actually picturing myself sitting on the other side as well. So it really, really helped me, and I'm really, really grateful.
Sure. Hi, my name's Gemma. I am a senior social worker. So yeah, I had a young ambassador on interview panel a few times. And I would say my experience is it was quite refreshing. I would say it felt quite meaningful for someone that's had a social worker to kind of shape the service that we offer.
Hi, my name's Kath and I'm a children's social worker in Pod 2 in Brighton. I was recently interviewed by a panel of 4 people, 2 managers, a social worker and a young person on the panel. For me, I'm a returning social worker, so I haven't been in social work for 5 years. The bit where you have a young person on the panel is really, really demonstrating your skills about interacting with young people, and that's really, really important. It was quite fun experience as well, having a young person interview me, and it felt really, that was lovely because it was really relaxing. It made the interview feel much more real. And I think the message it gave me is that it's a local authority that really really values listening to the voice of young people and really values working in partnership with young people and with families as well, you know, right the way through, and that was really important about not making decisions on behalf of young people, but young people working alongside social workers and making decisions with them, and that was a really important message for me to get when I was thinking about coming back into social work.
Brilliant.
My name's Carly Stockton. I'm the manager of the adolescent social work team for Brighton and Hove. I've had quite a few experiences of interviewing potential team members, so other social workers, with young ambassadors on the panel. And I can't imagine not doing it, really. It's so important. From a purely selfish level, it's a much more enjoyable experience when there are young people on the panel. At times, I've even been able to be on a panel with young people that I used to be a social worker for, and that has been really great to hear. In fact, I think we even interviewed Gemma at one point, and that's been such a lovely shared experience to do with someone that I cared so much about. And I think that young people on a panel, when we're interviewing, bring a real level of authenticity, because the young people are so good at seeing through the interview talk to the bits that actually really matter and to the bits that make them as young people want to hear more about what that person has to say, what would want to have that person as their social worker. And the young people that I've been with on panels have been so confident and interested and able to share their views. And they always, even if they found interviewing someone quite difficult because they haven't naturally felt very connected to them, they've always worked really hard to say positive things as well, which I think is such a skill that these young people are presenting in what they're bringing to the process.
Okay, so that should be.
Hi, I'm Deb Austin. I'm the Executive Director for Families, Children and Learning at Brighton and Hove City Council. I have been through a very recent recruitment process and was appointed on the 1st of February 2021. And as part of my recruitment process, I had 4 stakeholder panels, one of which was a panel consisting of young people. In terms of my experience of that, I found it both an enjoyable but also quite a challenging experience, which I think is a good thing. And to be honest, I would have been really disappointed if I hadn't been put in front of a group of young people and their opinions and views canvassed about me.
It was, yes. So I'm Tom Stibbs. I'm the Principal Social Worker for Children and Families for Brighton and Hove. And I was appointed to the post over 5 years ago now. But as part of that recruitment, like Deb, I also had a panel of young people as part of that recruitment process. And again, a bit like Deb, I found that both quite enjoyable and quite nerve-wracking. I remember before the interview being quite, worried about preparing for that panel and thinking about that panel, but actually really enjoying some of the conversation that I had with young people as part of the panel. I think it was really important as well because it felt like for the interview, a lot of the questions in the other panels or the other kind of work that I had to do as part of the recruitment process, a lot of it was kind of quite focused on quite strategic issues or operational issues, and having the panel of young people, I guess, really reminded me of both, I guess, what was really important about the principal social worker's role, but also why I wanted to do the job.
Well, we're a service that's delivering services to children, young people and their families, and about improving outcomes for children, young people and their families. And if we're going to do that well, we need to have authentic, child-focused staff. And for me, it's absolutely crucial that those staff can relate to children and young people, but probably more importantly, that young people can relate to our staff. And I think a young person's panel as part of a recruitment process is a window into that.
Thank you for that, Tom. And I can see you've been in the chat as well, and you've kindly put your email address at the end of the video there, which will be uploaded to YouTube and will be shared on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access the video again and find Tom's contact details. Just a quick sum up from it. Just really appreciate everyone's time today. Really appreciate all the speakers. Thank you to Gary. Thank you to Jenny. Thank you to Tom and to Debbie for bringing the content. This session is nothing without people coming to bring the excellent content that we've had today. Again, apologies for overrunning. It's always a big ask trying to get free speakers and free presentations into one session, but we really wanted to give people the full time. So appreciate that people maybe haven't been able to stay for the full session, but thank you to those that have. Catherine has added a link into the chat just to the survey that I talked about right at the start. Would really appreciate people filling that out. It'll only take a couple of minutes and it just gives us some feedback about the week and about the sessions. Again, a huge thank you to all the presenters and a huge thank you to everyone here today. We will end it there. Appreciate everyone's time, and thanks for joining us.